we're talking about all of these like little payments are adding up or like inflation that's happening. But I think like the biggest elephant in the room is probably housing. Compared, 5 years to now, it's went up dramatically. So question here about housing, and then we'll talk all about how the housing's went up over the year, or how like rent and mortgages and things like that have went up. So let's talk about it. So this person writes, how does anyone afford a home these days? My husband and I earn $110,000 a year and expect raises, but the cost of living in Seattle feels overwhelming. Our rent is $1,600, and with fixed expenses, we pay around $3,000 monthly. We saved $15,000, but after getting pre-approved for a $400,000 FHA loan, we realized that we can't afford the upfront costs, closing costs, down payment, and real estate fees totaling around $36K. Down payment assistance options come with second loans, and lowering our budget to $300K would mean leaving the area we love. We want to start a family, but even that feels out of reach. Is anyone else struggling with this? I feel like, Nick, if you're making $110,000 combined in like a high cost of living city like Seattle, it is just not realistic anymore.
Yeah.
Like those numbers, you're able to save the $15K. That's great. But like they said, they have to, all those other fees that, all those other, costs that come into it, which a lot of people don't play out. That's what's really stopping people too. So I don't know. I think, especially now living in a high cost of living city, like I definitely see this here, and I really wonder how people afford their lives if they're not making, I would say combined at least $150 a year in some of these areas. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, you came from California, but you have to know it better than anybody. But yeah, this is, I think a lot of people are struggling with this.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think you kind of you have to accept the reality of your situation. Yep. Like if you live in a very high cost of living city, like your income has to be there, yes. Right? Like, and look, not to bash on these people, right? Like making 100 over, 6 figures as a household, that's awesome, right? Yeah. And $15,000 saved up, that's awesome too. But like when you actually compare that to the numbers that you need to be able to afford a house like that, like things are just so different now, right? If we were talking like interest rates are at like 2 or 3%, you can get a really good rate on your mortgage. Like you could probably be close to affording that house. But now with interest rates at 7%, right? Like that house is probably, depending on how much you put down, could be like $3,000 a month. And if you're making 110, like, I don't know, that's going to take up 40, 50% of your budget right there, So I feel like people kind of have to be a little bit more realistic. And like, even like what this person said, we saved up 15, but that's not enough to cover all those costs. Like that's probably barely enough to cover their closing costs, Yep. And then does that mean you're borrowing 95% of your against your home, right? Like you're taking out a loan for 95% of it. Like now you're paying private mortgage insurance on top of it. I don't know. There's just so many factors here. And I'm even surprised to hear that they have, finding a home for $400,000 in Seattle. I mean, I don't really know what that market looks like, but my impression was that it was inside of Seattle in particular was just as expensive as most of California.
Yeah, same. I've heard the same thing, but I feel like in this situation, like what do these people do, right? Like, do you either understand that you can start a family without having to buy a house? You can just continue to rent. And honestly, you're telling me that's like you pay around $3,000 for everything. If your rent is $1,600, there's no way your housing payment's only going to be that, So I feel like just, if you like living there, which they say they do, you're probably just going to have to rent for right now until your incomes start to go up. Or you move to a lower cost of living city and afford a home, right? Because like $110K in my hometown in central Pennsylvania, you're living big. Yeah. I'm serious. That's probably a very high income for the area I come from. But if they're in Seattle, they're in Chicago, LA, like it's not even, you're not going to be able to get a house. And I hate that we're here, but I don't know. I do feel bad because things have changed so drastically. I also think we were a little spoiled with like 2 to 3% interest rates because that was an all-time like low.
Yeah, historically low, right?
Yeah, and because they were so low, like everybody was buying houses, which was like, driving up the cost of them. And now we're here and we're like, how did we get here? So I don't know. It's another thing we just talked about, like, are the costs ever going to go down of housing? I don't think so. I don't think we're going to be everyone's been buying expensive homes for the past 5 years. And do we think there's something going to go down and your home's going to depreciate? I just don't see it happening. So this is probably our new norm, like renting, lifetime renters, or moving to a lower cost of living city or further out. Like maybe you're, I don't know how many miles outside of Seattle you need to go to to have a house that you can afford. But I hate this situation, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, Washington's one of those like unique states where like you can be within proximity of a really big city, but if you're like 30, 45 minutes outside of the city, you can find things a little bit easier, right? Like in California, for example, like that's just not the case. Like if you're next to one of the major cities, even an hour outside, like prices go from $1 million to like 800,000, you know, like it's not saving you a ton of money. Right. And then like here in Austin, for example, you know, like if you're in the city, like you're looking at homes that are easily in $1 million plus, you know, like there's some neighborhoods that have multi-million-dollar homes. If you drive 20, 30 minutes outside of the city, you can find homes for $300,000-$400,000. And so it kind of gives you that range for, depending on what your income is, you kind of just have to adjust your expectations. But like, I don't know, like I hear what this person's saying, like they don't want to leave the area that they love. But I also think you have to be very realistic with the numbers, right? Like math isn't going to care about your feelings. Your budget's not going to care about your feelings. Like you're going to feel this if you try to make this work in a situation where it just doesn't. But like, try to expand like your world view a little bit, you know, like I'm sure like I've been to Seattle before. It's an awesome city. Like Washington in general, like the way it looks is just so it's a really beautiful state, right? Like same with California, beautiful state. But like we had to adjust our expectations a little bit. Like we're not going to afford $1 million home, right? Unless you're making like $300,000 a year inside of like the Bay Area, like it's just not realistic, right? And for us, I knew it was like, okay, if we could afford $1 million home, I would rather buy an investment property and then buy a primary residence, right? Yeah. So I think you kind of got to just be okay with adjusting those expectations, taking some time to explore a little bit and be like, all right, what are areas that we can afford? Like, what could I learn to love about these areas as well? You know? So yeah, but only $15,000 saved up for a $400,000 home. Like that's just not going to work, you know?
Yeah. But I mean, for like a couple making, you know, 110,000. So what they're each making like 55K each, like 15,000 is quite a bit of savings, you know? So I don't know. I think about that. And then I think about like the younger generations, like how, like I think about my niece, like she's like 20, I don't know, 23, 24. And I'm like, how is someone like her, like making an entry level income? How do they afford a home ever? You know, because that's something that I don't know, like I mean, unless they start saving right now and their incomes continue to like, you know, grow, I guess that would work. But it just seems like it's so far out of reach for the young people coming up. Like, you know, if you're more established in your career and, you know, these people, you know, they might be able to do this, but they might just have to wait a few more years and like try to increase their incomes. You know what I mean? Like they can probably make this happen as long as they, like she said, they continue or whoever continue, they expect raises. If they continue to grow their income, they probably can do this. And probably now they know the numbers. So they're like, okay, I need to save up a little bit more. But I'm like, some of these younger people coming out, is it even possible at this point? I don't know, especially in these big cities. What do you think about that?
I think it's possible, but I think you're going to really have to take advantage of like being so young, using your 20s to your advantage to really get a head start in life. And at that point, I don't even know if I'd call it a head start. Like I think the new normal of where you need to be into your 20s to be able to eventually afford a home, to be able to invest enough to retire well. Like, I think you got to be able to come out of college having approached college the right way, right? Like maybe you went to a state school, maybe you were working while you're in college, right? You have very minimal student loans, and the loans you do have, they're proportional to what your income is going to be. You can afford to pay them off, right? Like if you're not taking steps like that early in your 20s, like from when you're 18 to 22, it does get really hard, right? Because now you're pushing off like, okay, I'm debt free into my 30s, right? Which is still amazing, right? Yeah. But if you hit that point, like, okay, and you're saving up for a home and you're trying to invest and you're trying to get like an emergency fund saved, like there's just not enough runway for how many things you're going to want to do in the next few years. Because I feel like when people hit 30, like, all right, now if they don't already own, if they don't already have a family, like that's kind of when those questions start to come to the forefront, and they're like, all right, maybe I do want to start a family. Maybe I do want to buy a home, right? Like, and I need to get more serious about retirement. Like if you're just at that point starting to look into those things, now it suddenly becomes way unachievable, right? Like you need to be investing a heavy amount for retirement. You need to be saving a solid down payment. And then like, if you wanted to start a family or get married or whatever it is, right? Like those are all expensive things. Yeah. And if you're waiting until you're into your 30s or even 40s to like take those things seriously, like it just gets so much harder. So I don't think it's like, out of reach for young people, but I think they need to like start as early as possible. And I think a big part of that is like falls onto the parents, you know, like onto the parents for educating their kids when they are young adults, like, hey, this is the way that you have to manage your finances, because things are just more expensive now, right? Like things are going to be harder for you than they were for me, right? As your parent, right? Things are going to be harder for you. And so you really need to hit the ground running into adulthood to be able to afford these things.
The information, opinions, and recommendations provided on this podcast are for entertainment purposes only and do not constitute professional financial advice. Any financial decisions you make based on the content of this podcast are your responsibility. We strongly recommend consulting with a licensed financial advisor or other qualified professional before making any significant financial decisions. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledge that we are not liable for any financial outcomes.